Hello, everyone. This is a new series or playlist I want to start. I'm just going to call it Tabor Talks for short. And I'm going to take any number of topics and subjects, questions people have asked me, and 2 or 3 times a week, I'll respond to them and cover different things that come up from some of my longer videos that are available on my site. So today I want to talk about a question. I'll pose it as a question. Does the Gospel of Matthew teach the virgin birth of Jesus? Which seems like an obvious and easily answered question. Yes, after all, he's the one who quotes Isaiah 7:14 that is translated in English in many versions, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son. But let's talk about that a little bit. First of all, let me connect it to something. I'm going to share my screen here that I actually put up yesterday. This is my YouTube channel, and I think you can all see that. And here is the video I put up yesterday. It seems to really be picking up. It's already got 5,000 or 6,000 views. I think this screen, if I refreshed it, would go up a bit. It's only 17 minutes, and it's simply called An Unnamed Father of Jesus, not even a question mark. So people seem to be pretty interested in it. So this first Tabor talk, as I'm calling it, actually would relate to that because it would have to do with a question, that is, the father of Jesus, or if he had a father, or if he didn't have a father, just what that would all be about. So I'm going to stop that share, and I'm going to go to another screen of Matthew directly. I'm using here Accordance. You may or may not know Accordance. It's one of the many Bible programs for a scholar or an academic or any of you that want to go very deeply into these things. I really recommend Accordance. I think Logos and some of the others are good as well. But I've got on the screen here Matthew. I went ahead and put the Greek in. I know many of you might say, well, you don't know Greek, but I'll point out just a few things in the Greek. And here's what I want you to notice. Matthew, as he tells the story, is actually a story about Joseph, the legal father of Jesus, because he marries Mary, the mother of Jesus, when she's pregnant. And by doing that, he more or less adopts or takes the child as his own. And I think we're going to see the implication in this text is actually that he never tells anybody that it's not his child. In other words, the child gets known as Jesus, son of Joseph, as he is known. And in chapter 13 of Matthew, is this not the son of Joseph, the tekton, translated carpenter, but the builder, basically, is what it means. So Matthew's pretty open about that. What you may or may not have noticed, and many of you will have noticed this, that it starts, though, before you get to the birth. Here's the birth starting right down here when you get down to verse 18. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ took place this way. But the first 17 verses are a genealogy, a literal list, starting with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, because Isaac had the 12 sons. Judah is one of the sons. That becomes one of the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel is another name for Jacob. So again, many of you know that, but being basic here. And as you're going along, you simply have these generations as you count them off. And at the end, it talks about 14 generations from Abraham to David, then from David to the Babylonian captivity, which usually dates around 586, 587. Some people even put it 588, 14 generations. And then the deportation of Babylon to Jesus, the Christ, he calls him. No mystery about identifying who Jesus is. You know, in Mark, some of you taken my course on Mark, and if you haven't, obviously I encourage you to do so. because it's important to take these gospels separately and not conflate them. Let each one say what it wants to say. And in Mark, it's a mystery who Jesus is. You as the reader are told in the first verse, but after that, nobody knows. Matthew's completely different. In fact, when Jesus is baptized, it's announced to the crowd like a heavenly loudspeaker. God speaks from the clouds. This is my beloved son, hear you him. I think it says, in whom I'm well pleased, hear you him. So Matthew's very different in that way. And he just calls him the Christ right off, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So this is to tell you, namely and mainly, that Jesus is of the line of Judah, the line of David, the royal lineage of David, which you have to be in order to be the Messiah, according to many texts in the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 11, Jeremiah 23, and other texts like that. And it's qualifying him then to be called the Christ or the Messiah by his lineage or his heritage. The problem, of course, is right away when you begin the birth story in verse 18, you find out that Joseph is not the father. So this is a legal genealogy of Jesus. You might say an adopted genealogy of Jesus, but according to Matthew, this is not the biological lineage of Jesus. Now, Matthew says that. That's nothing that I'm adding here. He makes it very clear, as we're going to see. But what is it other than a list of 42 generations, 14, 14, and 14? What is it really? Something begins to happen. As he's going along from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob to Judah, he gets to Judah, and Judah has two sons. Look at my cursor, Perez and Zerah. And he adds, I've got it highlighted, by Tamar. And then he goes down and he talks about Boaz. If you remember, Boaz is the one who marries Ruth. And they have Obed, who is the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. And that begins the royal line of David. It's called in Isaiah 11, the stump of Jesse, from which the Messiahs or the anointed kings of Israel began to emerge, from that specific bloodline. It's very important. So he mentions Boaz, and then again you have by Rahab. And then it doesn't stop there. There are two more. And Boaz is the father of Obed by Ruth. Again, women. In other words, who were the mothers from whom these children came. And then it goes on, and David was the father of Solomon. Everybody's heard of Solomon, the son of David. He became king of Israel by the wife of Uriah. Again, that is a man's name, but it's talking about his wife. You probably know the name Bathsheba because it's such a famous name. David commits adultery with the wife of one of his commanders, Uriah. It's a horrible story of betrayal and adultery and even murder because he basically has Uriah killed. So it's not a pretty story. But again, you have a woman referred to. So the genealogy has these 42 men, but in 4 cases, you have the mothers mentioned, 3 by name and 1 by linking her without naming her to her husband Uriah, because he's actually not of the royal line, but because he's not the father of Solomon. David's the father. So David was the father of Solomon by another woman. Now, each of these 4 women, and again, many of you know this, but it's good to review it. They are not just any women. Normally, 2 things I want to say here. You do not mention women normally in a Jewish genealogy. It's simply a male legal line from father to son to son to son. Go back to Genesis 5 and so forth. That's the way it goes. Often, wives aren't even named when you do the generations of Noah. You don't tell. Everybody says, who was Noah's wife? We know it from legends. In terms of a name, we don't have that name. in the Bible itself, in the Hebrew Bible. So what is it? Why would you mention these 4 women? And as you begin to think about the stories around one of them, Tamar is the first one mentioned. She actually seduces Judah. She dresses like a prostitute and sits by the roadside because she has a grievance with him. But if you look it up in the Hebrew Bible, you'll find that she was promised a son and a marriage. She's actually in the household of Judah, and her husband dies, and Judah promises her that when one of his sons grows up, she will have him as a husband. So it was very important for legal transmission of being in that family. And he doesn't follow up. He doesn't let her marry one of his other sons. So she seduces him, and she actually has twins. You should read the story. It's in Genesis 38. It's really interesting. But the point is, it's sexually immoral by any average definition. It's not the normal wife or mother of one of these children in the holy line of Abraham, David, and the Messianic lineage. And then you come down to the next one, Boaz, and Matthew's the only one that reports this, but he says he's actually his mother, his father Salmon, and his mother is Rahab. And Rahab is known in the book of Joshua as a harlot or a prostitute, and she does help the Israelites. And assuming it's the same woman, again, sexual immorality, and yet she becomes part of the line. At least she's the second woman mentioned. And then Obed is born of Boaz by Ruth. And Ruth is that Moabite woman. The book of Ruth is devoted to her. And she basically, I would say, seduces Boaz. She gets him kind of drunk and feeds him a nice meal and crawls under the covers. And the next morning, behold, it's Ruth. So again, questionable woman in terms of normal marriage and relationships. And then finally, I've already mentioned David, father of Solomon, but by Bathsheba, who was not his wife, and it was actually adultery followed by murder. So it's pretty clear that Matthew intends to tell you these stories, and you're supposed to be kind of jolted when you get to the women's names, as if, why are you mentioning that? Oh, why are you mentioning her? Why are you mentioning this one? Why are you mentioning that one? 4 times, because these are 4 women known within the tradition or even in the Hebrew Bible itself as being women with, let's call it, irregular or even immoral sexual reputations. But they are the lineage of David, and they come all the way back to Abraham. So it's as if Matthew's signaling to you, the reader, when you get down to verse 18 and read about Mary getting pregnant by the Holy Spirit or of the Holy Spirit. Here's the Greek. It literally is ek pneumatos hagiou, of the Holy Spirit, or through the agency of the Holy Spirit. I would translate that in that particular construction. In other words, it's because of the Holy Spirit that she's pregnant. So you would be surprised. Oh, so it's not her husband, Joseph, or the one she's actually engaged to him. So before they came together, she was betrothed or engaged to him. She was found to be with child through the agency of the Holy Spirit. Now, most would read that as the Holy Spirit got her pregnant, but I'm going to suggest to you that that's not necessarily the meaning in Matthew. I think it is the meaning in Luke pretty clearly, because Mary says, how can I get pregnant because I've not known a man? And even in Luke, you might interpret it more loosely as, well, you're going to get pregnant by someone else, but it'll be through the Holy Spirit. If you go back to the book of Genesis, You get something similar to this with Abraham and Sarah. Remember that famous story where these messengers come to Abraham and to Sarah in the heat of the afternoon in the book of Genesis. And they say to him, you're going to have a child. And one of them's even identified as a kind of earthly Yahweh or Jehovah, because he's referred to actually as the Lord, the divine name, Yod-He Vav-He. And Sarah laughs or scoffs, remember, hearing that she may have a child because she's old and past menopause. And Abraham's old. Abraham's in his 90s and she's in her 80s, as I recall. So how could she have a child? But what the messenger tells her, the one who's called Jehovah, at this time next year, I will come to you and Sarah will become pregnant. Now, it doesn't mean, as it might sound, through the agency of Jehovah she'll become pregnant, that the text is saying that God impregnates her, because clearly in the text and elsewhere in the context, we're told that Isaac, Abraham's son, is of his own body. So he is a biological child of Abraham, but it's through the agency of, you might even say, the Holy Spirit or Yahweh or Jehovah, the messenger of God. So you can see the versatility there of that phrase, what it, different range of meanings. So anyway, they're engaged and she's found pregnant. Now, one thing he knows that it's not his child because he's never slept with her. He's never had sexual intercourse with her. And what we're told is that her husband, he's called her husband, literally it's her man. In Greek, you can say my man, my woman, kind of like in German. And it can mean husband and wife, depending on the context. So her man, Joseph, the man she's going to marry, was a just man, and he was unwilling to put her to shame. And he resolved to divorce her quietly. So he's going to follow the Torah, which says that if a woman becomes pregnant out of wedlock, especially an engaged woman, then he can put her away. But he's going to do it quietly. He's not going to shame her. He's not going to announce it even to the local village elders and drag her before the authorities and condemn her. So he's thinking about it. He's thinking of just doing something private. I'm not sure what he particularly had in mind, but it's going to be quiet and not public. And then he has this appearance. This angel of the Lord appears to him in a dream. So he has a dream, and he's in the dream, he's told, Joseph, son of David, notice he is the descendant of David. We've just seen that. Do not fear to take Mary, your woman or your wife, for that which is conceived in her, she's already pregnant, is of the Holy Spirit. Same phrase again, through the agency of the Holy Spirit. So don't be afraid to take her. Take her. And he's basically being told, marry your pregnant wife, and her child will be your child, legally speaking. Now, that's not going to solve the biological question of whose biological son is Jesus, what is his lineage, but it is going to solve the problem of any kind of shameful treatment by the village elders or other authorities. This all took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name will be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. This goes back to Isaiah 7. In the Greek, you have the word Parthenos. Now, people get all agitated about this, and they talk about, Parthenos is used in the Greek, and it does mean a virgin. And in the Hebrew, it's alma, which can mean a young woman. This is just much ado about nothing. A young woman is presumed to be a virgin. If she's been immoral, you, of course, would not call her a Parthenos. She could be by age a young woman, but she would be considered a defiled or immoral young woman. Same with a young woman, alma. It doesn't mean virgin. And Parthenos doesn't have to mean virgin, but it's implied. Now, the quote in context has nothing to do with Jesus. In Matthew, when he says all this took place to fulfill, it's not this idea of fulfilling a prediction. It's saying this is like that. And if you look it up in Isaiah 17, it is absolutely, definitely not talking about Jesus. Anyone who studied it knows that. It's not a prediction of the virgin birth. It's a prediction about a young, virtuous woman having a child, and that child becoming a sign of God with us. In Isaiah 7, it's in the time of Isaiah, the birth of a child that he's told will be born. And in the time of Joseph here, it's Mary's child. So he awakes from his sleep, and he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took his woman, literally, it's the word, he took his woman, his wife, but he knew her not until she had borne a son, and he called his name Jesus. So that's the birth story in Matthew. So looking back at it, you can see what it's saying. No perpetual virginity. People, this is an idea that develops later in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, because the idea of Mary being always a virgin, ever Virgin Mary, perpetual virgin, began to develop, partly because an aversion for sexuality and the idea of holiness. And finally, for example, in the Greek tradition, Joseph can have children by a previous marriage, and that's the way they handle the idea of Jesus's brothers and sisters. In the Roman Catholic Church, even Joseph has to be celibate, so he can't have any children. And the brothers and sisters that Mark clearly says, this is Jesus, the son of Mary, and names the brothers, clearly in context, born of Mary, so that Mary has at least 7 children, probably 8, and she might have been pregnant, as women were in those times, more than the 7 or 8 that are referred to in Mark 6, verse 3, because often people lose children in this time during childbirth or shortly thereafter. But either way, this is basically a story about how Joseph found his wife pregnant. He was convinced in the dream that it was through the agency of God. So he took her as his wife pregnant, meaning he took the child Jesus as his own. I don't need to tell you that this has happened countless times with all kinds of varying circumstances. People that do DNA tests often find that even their father or a grandfather or a great-grandfather turns out biologically not to be of the lineage that they thought from their family name. It's really common. Lots of times this might happen and nobody would ever know. In this case, it's revealed to Joseph. I don't know that he ever tells anybody, and Jesus is called a son of Mary. Now, in the video that I pointed to, that I put up, an unnamed father of Jesus, we find out that there are rumors in the life of Jesus that maybe there was something irregular about his birth. Maybe somebody noticed the pregnancy before the marriage. We're not told exactly when he married her. And even in the book of Luke, which I'm going to encourage you to read Matthew just as Matthew. Let's go with just what Matthew says. But in the book of Luke, it seems like he doesn't take her formally as his wife until after the birth of Jesus. But I think that's actually trying to remove Jesus from any kind of sexuality. But here, he does take her, but he doesn't sleep with her. So the marriage is not consummated, as we say today, and calls his name Jesus. Now, is this a virgin birth? Yes, it's a virgin birth, if by virgin you mean a virtuous young woman who's engaged becomes pregnant. As to who the father is, this is a story of Joseph being told to take her anyway. I guess a better term might be not virgin birth as much as virgin conception, because to be a virgin after somebody's born is not really the idea in this text. Now, I've got a text here. I'm going to stop the screen share. And there are many versions of the New Testament Apocrypha, but this is the old collection. It used to be called Hennicus Nahmelcher, two German names. This is the English translation. I think it was done by Wilson. I like this. This is the second edition. And in this very interesting text from the 2nd century, some people put it in the second, some people as late as the third. It's called the Proto-Evangelium of James. Sometimes it's called the Pseudo-Evangelium of James. So basically, I'm just calling it the Gospel of James. And we've got a number of copies of it. It's about Mary being born, and it gives the names of Mary's parents, Joachim and Anna. It says that Joachim is a very wealthy man. And like many of the stories in the Hebrew Bible, his wife cannot get pregnant. Remember Hannah and all the other stories of, Sarah, I've already mentioned, wife of Abraham, no children. And so to make the story short, because it's pretty extended, it tells Mary's childhood and how she grows up and so forth. It finally gets to Mary. And there's a pretty similar story. It follows Luke more than Matthew, of Mary being betrothed to Joseph, but he's an old man who's widowed, who already has children, at least probably 6 or 7 children. We know 4 boys and maybe 2 or 3 girls. And so these children that in Mark are Mary's children now become his children, and he becomes the caretaker who would never possibly be sexual with this young woman. So it's a completely different story from way over 100 years later, when this idea is coming in that Mary must be celibate and a perpetual virgin. And we catch it right at the time when Joseph is now going to be celibate, certainly with this young 14-year-old, which she is in the story. But he has been married before. So this is more of a Greek interpretation, which the Greek Orthodox Church would hold today. Now, what's interesting is when the child is born. I've got to read you this because it's pretty amazing. So they're down in Bethlehem and they're in a cave, and the midwife comes, and suddenly there's a cloud, and the cloud disappears, and a light appears in the cave. This reminds you of the Genesis Apocryphon that's in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the birth of Noah. So it's very elaborated and obviously quite extended mythologically. A great light appears in the caves, and our eyes could not bear it. So at the birth of Jesus, Mary's the mother, you're just blinded by the light. A short time afterwards, the light withdrew, and the child appeared. So it implies that the child kind of passes through the womb without being born. In other words, these people are so concerned that even Mary having the child by natural childbirth through the vaginal canal, through normal birth, is going to spoil her virginity. It almost gets humorous at that point because the child just appears, the light goes away, the child appears, and it went and took the breast of his mother Mary. So it looks like it can already walk, or maybe it crawled over and it just goes over like, here I am, Mom, and begins to nurse. And the midwife cries, how great is this day for me, for I've seen this new sight. What a miracle. And the midwife came out of the cave, and Salome met her. Now, this Salome, we think, is one of Joseph's girls. I would say she's obviously in Mark, Jesus' sister. And she says, Salome, Salome, I've seen a new sight. A virgin has brought forth a thing which her nature does not allow. Her nature, meaning she's intact. She hasn't had a child really come out of her body. by the normal birth. I guess you could call it cesarean, but it would be divine cesarean because of nobody's cut open or anything like that. And Salome said, as the Lord my God lives, unless I put forward my finger and test her condition, I will not believe that a virgin has brought forth. Now, this is really a bizarre story. Actually reminds you of the Thomas story in John 20. I want to put forth my finger into the wound. This is into the womb. And she's actually going to test her condition. So she went in and made Mary ready and said, get ready, Mary. I'm going to have to do this pelvic exam of you. And it actually describes it. And she put forward her finger to test her condition to see if she's still a virgin, presumably looking for her hymen. And then suddenly her hand is burnt, and it actually says her hand, I'll read, is consumed with fire. So her hand begins to flame, maybe it's even injured. And then she bows before the Lord, and an angel comes and says, stretch out your hand and touch him, and you'll be healed. And then she's healed. So this is really taking Matthew way beyond Matthew. I think you would agree. And it shows the extent to which this idea of the virginity is not only not having sexual intercourse, but even if Mary's seen to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit, she can't even have the child by normal childbirth. The child just has to appear. So what you're doing is you're divinizing these human beings. It's done later to Jesus, by the Docetists especially. People don't want to think of these as flesh and blood human beings. It's done eventually to Mary, not so much in the New Testament, but in these later texts. There even, I have this book coming out about the lost Mary. There are even texts later. She didn't go to the toilet, she didn't defecate or urinate because she took just enough water and food, like the angels, where it was what her body needed. And of course, in the full story of Mariology, when she dies, she's even taken up to heaven and made into a divine being and sits with Jesus and God the Father at the throne of God, interceding for humanity, the kind of assumption of Mary. I won't go into Immaculate Conception. That's something different. That has to do with the idea of original sin. A lot of people confuse Immaculate Conception with the so-called virgin birth, which in Matthew is a virgin conception more than a virgin birth, because clearly when Jesus is born, there's no hint in Matthew that she stays a virgin. And in fact, there's no hint, by the birth, because of the birth, and there's no hint that she even never has intercourse with Joseph. It plainly says he knew her not until she had brought forth her firstborn son, which means then he did know her. It's the plain reading of the text. Everybody knows that, even though there are all these convoluted explanations, particularly among Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox and others who want to protect this perpetual virginity of Mary idea. It's late, it's derived, it's really not a biblical idea, it's not an early idea within this particular text. So what is Matthew really about? If you sum it up and just read Matthew, it doesn't tell you how she gets pregnant. It does tell you it's through the agency of the Holy Spirit. But Mary's birth in the James Evangelium, Mary's birth from Joachim and Anna, is also spoken of like that. In other words, it's not real clear how Anna gets pregnant, because he can't get her pregnant and then suddenly she becomes pregnant. So it begins to parallel some of the Greek and Roman mythologies about a woman becoming pregnant by a divine God or something like that. But I don't think it's really that. It's more in the vein of the Hebrew Bible, that someone is made pregnant by the agency of God in a special way, and the child is blessed in a way that would go beyond the ordinary. Now, what the writer of Matthew really thinks about that, I don't know. but by naming Rahab the prostitute, by naming Tamar, who plays the role of a prostitute, Bathsheba, who commits adultery, and Ruth, who crawls in bed with Boaz. Surely that's more than a wink to the reader to be cautious before you judge this young girl for having this child. So Joseph's told the child is holy, and he marries her anyway, and everybody thinks she's Joseph's child. So I'm going to continue this. I'm going to talk about the other birth story that's in Luke at another time, but I will put at the in the description, and at the end, I'm going to put into this video the link to the previous one that I put up yesterday, an unnamed father of Jesus. And then if you're interested in knowing more about that, you can also go to my blog, where I have entries, jamestabor.com. Just type in Pantera, P-A-N-T-H-E-R-A, or look on my YouTube channel. You can do a search for Pantera, and I have other things about this unnamed father of Jesus that does get named in some sources and who he might have been. So I hope you learned from this, and I'm going to begin this series of Tabor Talks, and this is number 1, and I hope there are many, many more to come. Take care, everybody.